to allow me to present my research to you today. This research is titled Admonished, and it looks at peer reactions to subordinates' use of servant leader behaviors, or as Ian might say, non-managerial employees' use of servant leader behaviors. Co-authors on this project are Sandy Wayne. She was my chair for this. This is my qualifying paper at UIC, which is essentially a chapter of your dissertation. Since I finished the qualifying paper, co-authors that have been added: Bob Leiden, Nathan Eva, and Gary Schwartz. So I'm excited to share this with you all. So when I use this term, subordinate use of servant leader behaviors, I want to explain to you what I'm referring to by that. So I want to show you an example from the vignette that was used in one of our studies, similar to, I think, one that Terrence used, and also borrowed from June Fong's research, manipulating servant leader behaviors. So in this example, participants read about a team they were working on, and they were shown that as the team was putting finishing touches on a major project, Pat, who is a hypothetical teammate, realized there was a major design flaw. Once the problem was made aware to the team, Pat challenged everyone on the team to contribute their ideas for solutions to the problem. And Pat even asked Terry for their thoughts, and Terry's usually the quiet one in the group. So in this situation, Pat is using servant leader behaviors towards their peers who are also at the same level of the hierarchy with them. And this is an example of the empowering dimension of servant leadership. Just for reference, we're using Bob Leiden's framework of 7 dimensions of servant leader behaviors. So of course, there are other things that a subordinate can use towards their peers, such as emotional healing, putting others first, helping them grow and succeed. So the question is, if a follower or a non-managerial employee is using these behaviors towards their peers, how do their peers react to these behaviors? And the idea is, when leaders use these behaviors, they benefit interpersonally. But the question is, do benefit interpersonally to the same degree that their leaders would? Perhaps peers would be grateful, because a lot of these behaviors are supportive. They're very similar to OCBIs, where I'm getting emotional healing and supporting my coworkers, but some of them are more leader-like in fashion. So helping my fellow followers grow and succeed is more of a leader behavior than is a peer behavior. And the question is, do some peers get suspicious? And what made me think of this research question was my experience as a training director before my PhD. We included servant leadership in our leadership development, and we noticed that leaders started using servant leadership behaviors, but also the subordinates were using those behaviors as well within their work groups. And in some situations it was appreciated, and in some situations it backfired a bit, where they're asking, why are you acting like this towards me? You're not my boss. So that was the motivation for this research. So let me quickly walk you through the 2 theories that we're applying here. The first, probably the most obvious, is social exchange theory. I know, as Ian said, very overused in servant leadership research, but it's beneficial in this regard because it explains why would peers be appreciative and show gratitude for these behaviors that they're receiving from their peers. And in a nutshell, it says that we tend to reciprocate valued social resources. We're also using attribution theory to suggest that when they receive these resources in the form of servant leader behaviors, they're going to want to infer the motives, and what they like to do is look at patterns of behaviors. So over time, how does this individual act, and how does that influence my attributions I ascribe to these behaviors? So let's start building the model here. The first hypothesis is the most simple, and it says that if followers use servant leader behaviors towards their peers, they're going to receive OCBIs in return. And for the practitioners, OCBIs are just interpersonal helping behaviors. So if my coworker is absent from work, I'll help them catch up. If they have a personal problem, I'll give them some personal assistance. The theory suggests that if we have personal and intangible resources exchange, and that's like, I'm giving you something that is personally relevant to you, that's what servant leaders do, but it's also intangible and we can't put a price tag on the resource, then it's going to tend to instigate social exchange. And in return, their peers can reciprocate a valued social resource in the form of interpersonal OCBs, or interpersonal organizational citizenship behaviors. So, to the extent that a follower is using these servant leader behaviors, they're likely to receive OCBIs from their peers in return. The second hypothesis is what would explain this link between using SLBs and receiving OCBIs, and the idea is that pro-social reputation is built by using these behaviors, and that explains why they receive OCBIs from their peers. Part of attribution theory is this idea of the discounting principle. It says if behavior persists despite disincentives and internal motivation is ascribed, and essentially, if we believe that servant leader behaviors are not used for personal gain. There's nothing to be gained out of them. Sometimes they come at a cost of the actor. Then we're more likely to assume there's internal motivation. There's not some other reason that they're doing these other than they want to help me out. So, to the extent that I use these behaviors, I'll garner a pro-social reputation among my peers, and everybody wants to help the team player and reciprocate OCBIs. Social exchange theory would say that if I know someone is a team player, they're pro-social in nature, if I help them, I'm much more likely to get the help in return. So far we got mediation where if they use SLBs, they garner a pro-social reputation, and that pro-social reputation yields the receipt of OCBIs. The interesting question, though, I think about this research is, why would peers be more likely to ascribe a pro-social reputation? And are there situations where they might assume that there are ulterior motives other than pro-social motives? So, attribution theory suggests that when I'm trying to figure out why someone's doing a behavior, I look at patterns of their behavior, the consistency of their behavior. Do they use this behavior on a day-to-day basis, or is it abnormal? And what are other people doing? Is this a normal behavior in the work environment, or is this something very unique? These things give me some clue as to maybe what the underlying motives are. So that suggests some boundary conditions, of which we have two. The first boundary condition is impression management. So if you're not familiar, it's any behavior we can use to enhance our self-image. So like brown-nosing or careerism, or trying to look better than I am would be a form of impression management. And the idea is that can represent an alternative explanation for these behaviors. Attribution theory says if there's any potential for an alternative explanation, that undermines the potential for internal motivation. So if I know that somebody tends to use impression management on a day-to-day basis, they're usually sucking up to the boss, then this might just be another form of impression management. Maybe it's not so pro-socially motivated. So what we're suggesting is that this can weaken the indirect effects. For followers who tend to use impression management more often, their pro-social reputation will be not as strong for the same use of servant leader behaviors. So it weakens the indirect effects at the first stage of the model. There is a second boundary condition, and that is authenticity, which we've brought up a couple times today and yesterday. But the idea is if someone's authentic at work, they bring their true self to work, and their actions are a reflection of their intentions and motives. There's nothing underlying their behavior other than authentic reasons. So it would suggest that if someone's authentic on a day-to-day basis, these behaviors are just another form of their authenticity, and we can accept them at face value, at their face value of pro-social intentions. So if a follower is using servant leader behaviors, and they're also perceived as authentic on a day-to-day basis outside of the use of these behaviors, then their peers are more likely to accept them as pro-social in nature. And that would strengthen the pro-social reputation that they gain from using the servant leader behaviors. So here's the full model. Moderated mediation with two moderators at the first stage. But the idea is we're trying to figure out what are the patterns of behavior that peers can look to and infer the motives underlying the servant leader behaviors, and how can that influence the downstream outcomes of received OCBIs. So let me walk you through two studies we have collected and a brief introduction to the third study that's in progress. First study, we wanted to test the direct effects. This was a self-report study, so we couldn't get at peer attributions. We just wanted to see if they reported using these behaviors more, they also report receiving OCBIs more. And we asked them also to what extent do you use impression management, and to what extent are you authentic on a day-to-day basis in your work role. So this was a time-lagged self-report. At time 1, we captured the IVs and the moderators. At time 2, we captured the DVs. I'll skip the regression results by numbers, and I'll just show you the plots. The first hypothesis was true. If you use more SLBs, you receive more OCBIs. Now these two plots represent the two boundary conditions. On the left is impression management. You'll notice that regardless of how much impression management you use, the relationship is positive between SLBs and OCBIs. So regardless if someone was always using impression management, they still received OCBIs in turn for using servant leader behaviors. And the difference at high and low levels was not significantly different. So it did not moderate the relationship. Regardless of impression management, you received OCBIs. But for authenticity, it did moderate the relationship. At high levels of authenticity, the relationship was stronger, such that if I use more servant leader behaviors, I receive more OCBIs if I'm also more authentic. And if I'm lower in authenticity, Interestingly, it's still a positive relationship, but it's just less positive. So authenticity did moderate the relationship, and pressure management did not. So just to quickly recap study 1, there was support for the direct effects. For one of the boundary conditions, it was supportive authenticity, but the main limitation was that we don't get to look at peer reactions, and that's really, I think, the interesting part of this research is how do peers interpret the behaviors, and how does their interpretation drive their response. So we wanted to do a second study with collecting peer ratings. What we did was we set up an experimental vignette method where we manipulated servant leader behaviors. In one condition, it was high. They used a lot of behaviors towards their peers. The other condition was neutral. They did not use the behaviors towards their peers. So if you think back to the earlier example of Pat trying to encourage people to share their ideas, in the neutral condition, Pat said, let's just ask the leader what we should do. So we asked the participants, based on what you've observed about Pat, to what extent do you think they have a pro-social reputation, and to what extent would you give them OCBIs? So I want to quickly show you a comparison of means that shows our manipulation worked. On the left is just the manipulation check where we ask them the SL7. Does Pat use servant leader behaviors? And on the high condition, yes, they did. In the neutral condition, it was much lower. Same for pro-social reputation. Pat in the high condition had a much higher pro-social reputation. So the manipulation was effective. To test the hypotheses, we used path analysis, and I'll try to quickly walk you through these numbers. The first line are the indirect effects testing mediation. Pro-social reputation did mediate the relationship between SLVs and OCBIs. And the moderated mediation effects, or the index of moderated mediation for impression management, was significant and negative. So impression management weakened the effects of SLVs through pro-social reputation onto OCBIs. For the conditional indirect effects, this is testing at high and low levels of the moderator. And at both high and low levels of impression management, there were still positive indirect effects. So it still netted you OCBIs. For authenticity, the same pattern is true, just the opposite. It strengthened the indirect effects. So authenticity was a significant moderator on the indirect effects in that it increases your pro-social reputation and the OCBIs you receive. And again, at both high and low levels of authenticity, the effects are still positive. So across both studies, the hypotheses received mostly support, with the exception of impression management as a boundary condition. I can talk more about why that might be theoretically and empirically later, but for now I'll just suffice it to say, generally supported hypotheses. So what are the implications here? The first, theoretically, we know that these ostensibly selfless behaviors that are servant leader behaviors might not always be accepted as pro-social or appreciated as pro-social, and it really comes down to how do the peers perceive that behavior that drives their reaction to it. From the practical side, we should be aware that we might have our motives questioned, and if we want to help people, it should be a daily motivation to help people. I think we've already talked about that as well. The more we vary, the more it might be that people infer ulterior motives. So, all right, quickly I'll reference study 3, which is funded by Free Nave Scholars Project. I'm super appreciative of that. We just collected data. We wanted to do a field site so we can not rely on prolific data for our study 3, but also get multi-source ratings from the focal employee, how much do you use these behaviors, and from their peers, what are your perceptions? So, pretty good sample of 516 individuals across 111 teams. This allows us to control for serving culture or serving climate, because if it's a high climate of serving, then maybe it's less weird to use these behaviors. We're just underway of data analysis, so I don't have those results yet, but if you're interested, I will share them as soon as they're available. So, that's it. Thank you.